This happened quite a few years ago when I was renting a small house in the town where I had landed my first full-time job. It was a cozy, single-story house with 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and just enough living space for me. It was perfect for occasional visits from friends or family. I'd been living there for about a month and everything seemed fine. The landlord, who I'll call Karen, was kind and understanding. I had a feeling she rented the house to me because she preferred having a woman tenant rather than a man. I'll skip over unnecessary details and get straight to what happened. A few weeks into my stay, something strange began to occur. It was a typical Thursday night when I heard a knock at my door. I went to the door and asked, "Who is it?" But no one answered. I didn't open it. No one should have been knocking on my door so late at night. The next morning, after I'd gotten ready for work and was heading out, I opened the front door to find a large, sticky note taped to the storm door. It read, "Hello, beautiful." Immediately, my thoughts went back to the knock from the night before. It had to be the same person. The big question, though, was who? Feeling disgusted, I crumpled up the note and threw it away, hoping it was just a one-time incident. That night, I was making dinner when I heard another knock at the door, this time earlier than before. I walked over to the door but didn't say anything, I just listened. The storm door didn't lock and there wasn't a peephole or any glass for me to look through, so there was no way to see who it was without opening it. But I wasn't about to do that. This was the second night in a row and it was dawning on me that this wasn't random. It felt like some kind of stalker situation. I called my mom and dad for advice. My dad, a retired police officer, told me the police wouldn't be much help unless they caught the person in the act. He advised me not to go outside at night, not to answer the door, and to let him know if it continued. He offered to come stay with me if things didn't get better. The next morning, the first thing I did was check the storm door. My heart sank when I saw another note stuck to the glass. This one read, "I like to watch you." I immediately snapped a photo of it and sent it to my family and to Karen, my landlord. I asked Karen if she'd had any issues with men or anyone suspicious before. She seemed genuinely surprised and concerned when I showed her the note. She insisted she hadn't had any problems like this and assured me that she was in a long-term relationship. Still, I wasn't entirely convinced. That evening after work, I left a note of my own on the storm door. It read, "If you're looking for Karen, she doesn't live here. She only rents this house out. If you keep coming here, I will report this to the police." Writing and posting the note gave me a bit of relief. I felt like I'd taken some control of the situation. That night I was on edge, jumping at every little sound. Thankfully, there were no knocks on the door, and I managed to get some sleep. The next morning, however, I discovered the note I'd left had been replaced. The new note read, "I'm not looking for Karen. I'm looking for you," and it had my name written on it. Beneath that it said, "I like watching you," just like the previous note. I felt a wave of nausea as I sent the photo to my dad. He didn't waste any time. He packed a bag and drove to my house that same day. By the time I got home from work, he was already there. Work that day had been unbearable because my mind was entirely consumed by this situation. That evening, my dad and I decided to call the police. We figured whoever was doing this might be nearby, so we wanted them to see police presence. Only one officer showed up. It must have been a busy night. My dad's background as a retired officer seemed to help as we talked things over. After taking the report, the officer left, but my dad stayed on the front stoop for hours, keeping watch. Whoever had been stalking me didn't return that night. A few days later, I packed my things and moved out. Karen was understanding and didn't make the process difficult. Thankfully, whoever was stalking me at that house didn't follow me to my new place, which ruled out the possibility that it was a coworker or someone who knew me personally. I'll probably never know who it was, and that's something I've had to come to terms with. I'll be honest with you, I've spent more time chasing women than I'd care to admit. I had to tone it down a lot after college, partly because of what I'm about to tell you. Back in 2016, I went to school in Arizona. While I haven't been back in a while, when I was there, the social scene was incredibly open. And when I say open, I mean wild. This could have been true for other colleges at the time, but I wouldn't know. It was my sophomore year, and I had just finished pledging a fraternity called Kappa Sigma. By mid-semester, though, I was starting to get tired of the same old scene, talking to sorority girls who seemed to know every guy in every frat. It felt gross. I began worrying that any girl I was interested in had probably been with several guys I personally knew. So, I decided to try something different and created a Tinder profile. It wasn't long before I matched with someone whose interests seemed to align with mine. Her name was Isabella. We started talking and things were going well. After a few days, we made plans to meet up at a local college bar called The Corner Spot on a Friday night. It was one of my favorite bars. It had pool tables, and I'd been a pool shark since I was 10. I got there early to secure a table and warm up a bit, but an hour passed, and I had to face the possibility that I'd been stood up. I was debating whether to salvage the night or just head home to play some online chess when I got a notification. It was Isabella, apologizing and saying she just arrived. I greeted her at the door, and we hit it off right away. She apologized for being late, and soon we were getting drinks, playing pool, and getting to know each other. Isabella was Latina, charismatic, and a surprisingly heavy drinker. I got plastered just trying to keep up with her. At one point, she asked for my Instagram. Seconds later, I found myself staring at a collection of explicit photos she had sent me. I was confused, but in my drunken state, I wasn't about to complain. Before I could even respond, she grinned and said, "Your turn." Despite my better judgment, or lack of it, I complied. We laughed about it and carried on. A few hours later, as the bar was winding down, I planned to invite her back to my place, but she beat me to it. She asked if I wanted to spend the night at her place instead. I agreed, and we left the bar. I could barely walk in a straight line. It was embarrassing. We Ubered to her apartment, which, to my surprise, was in East Phoenix. Red flags should have been going off the moment we crossed into that part of town. When we arrived, she unlocked the door and gestured for me to go in first. I took a few steps into the pitch-black apartment and heard the door shut behind me. As I turned to ask her to turn on the lights, the room suddenly lit up. My heart dropped. I wasn't facing a harmless 5 feet 2 inches girl anymore. Instead, two massive, bald guys in tank tops stood by the door with their arms crossed. Behind me, another bald man loomed. I froze, unable to process what was happening. The man in front of me started listing my full name, birthday, and age. Then, he dropped the bombshell. Isabella was 17. This meant the photos I had sent and received could land me in serious trouble. The man smirked and said I'd better do as they asked. Terrified, I complied. They took my phone, wallet, and keys. When I asked what they wanted, the guy in charge explained that he was a major drug distributor in Arizona. He said that unless I distributed his products to my fraternity and university, he'd report me as a predator. My stomach churned. The two men behind me handed me a notepad and told me to write down my address and a list of as many names and numbers as I could. Panicked, I told them I'd need my phone to complete the list. One of the men held it firmly in front of me while I scrolled through my contacts. As they hovered over me, adrenaline kicked in. The moment I saw an opening, I bolted. I dashed out the door and ran as fast as I could. I didn't care where I was going. I just had to get away. Eventually, I found a well-lit house and pounded on the door, begging for help. The residents let me in and I called 911. When the police arrived, I explained everything. An officer drove me around and somehow I managed to retrace my steps to the apartment. But when the police stormed the place, it was completely deserted. There were no signs anyone had even been there. Over the following weeks, the police took my case seriously. They launched an investigation and concluded that it was likely gang-related, but they never made any arrests. That was years ago. Looking back, what happened to me is probably just another statistic in the sea of crime in that area. I haven't touched a dating app since. I've been smoking cigarettes every day for years. Before you judge me, let me just say that I recently started seeing a therapist to help with my nicotine addiction. Unfortunately, it hasn't helped much. The only thing worse than my nicotine habit is my awful sleep schedule. I don't know why. but I find myself staying up well past 2 a.m. most nights and rarely getting out of bed before 11 a.m. While I'm trying to fix these parts of my life, they're extremely relevant to what I'm about to tell you. It all started back in late March. I was standing on my balcony, like I do most nights, smoking a cigarette. I live in a really quiet neighborhood. The houses aren't exactly close to one another, but from my balcony I can see over my neighbor's fence. I'm not the nosy type, but this particular night I found myself glancing into his yard. I'd never actually met the guy, but I assumed he lived alone since I only ever saw a dark green Toyota parked in his driveway. But that night, there was a black van parked in front of his house. I didn't think much of it at first, just made a mental note of the change. The next night, though, I made a point to check his yard again, and sure enough, the van was parked there once more. I wasn't assuming anything sinister. I was just curious. By the third night, I started paying closer attention. In the mornings, the van would be gone. For the rest of the week, I turned it into a weird little game, observing the van at night and trying to guess what it was doing there. I wasn't poking around or anything, but I guess you could say I was obsessing a little. It's a bad habit of mine and probably the reason why most of my friends have drifted away over the years. It wasn't until one particular night in early April that things started to feel off. I stayed up later than usual. It was around 4:30 a.m. I was on my balcony smoking my last cigarette when I saw my neighbor walk out of his house for the first time. He was carrying what looked like a long black bag. At first I thought it might be golf clubs, but the way he carried it, it seemed much heavier. He walked over to the van, slid the side door open, and carefully placed the bag inside. Then, without a second glance, he got in the driver's seat and sped off. I had no idea what to make of it. I was too exhausted to overthink it, so I figured I'd analyze it more the next day. The following night, I decided to go out on my balcony earlier, around 10:30 p.m., to see if the van would show up. I brought my laptop with me to get some work done while I waited. By 1 a.m., the van pulled into his driveway. This time I watched closely. The engine stayed on for a few minutes before the driver's door opened. My neighbor stepped out and went around to the side of the van, sliding the door open again. He pulled out the same black bag, but this time he seemed to struggle with it. Whatever was in there looked heavier than before. Slowly, he waddled toward his house and disappeared inside. At this point, my curiosity was at its peak. Something was definitely wrong. The next morning, I made up my mind. I was going to follow that van. Around 4 a.m. the following night, I saw movement in his driveway. I grabbed my keys, ran to my car, and waited with my headlights off. When the van turned onto the main road, I followed at a safe distance. After about 25 minutes, the van pulled onto a dirt path leading into the woods. I hesitated but decided to keep going. Eventually, the path opened up into a clearing and I saw it. A run-down gas station tucked away in the middle of nowhere. Parked in front of it was the same green Toyota from his driveway. I pulled over and waited, unsure of what to do. After nearly an hour, the Toyota finally left the clearing. I decided to investigate. I parked my car a little further up the road and walked back to the gas station. It felt eerie, like the place hadn't been touched in decades. The doors were locked and the windows wouldn't budge. Against my better judgment, I picked up a rock and shattered one of the windows. That's when the alarms went off. The sound was deafening and I panicked. I sprinted back to my car and sped off, my heart racing the entire time. The whole way home, I couldn't stop wondering, why would an abandoned gas station have a working alarm system? When I got back, I called 911, gave them a vague description of what I'd seen, and hung up. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of police sirens. When I stepped onto my balcony, I saw at least 6 police cars in my neighbor's driveway. Officers were escorting him out of his house in handcuffs. One by one, the cars drove away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I've tried asking the police for details, but they won't tell me anything. A week later, I drove back to the gas station, only to find the road blocked off. Sometimes I think about going back through the woods to find answers. Maybe one day, I'll work up the courage. I'm not someone who ever dealt with sleep disorders like sleep paralysis or night terrors. In fact, I've always been a deep sleeper. So when what I'm about to share started happening, it completely blindsided me. Sure, we all have the occasional nightmare. I used to joke that nightmares were like free 3D horror movies. That might sound strange to some, but there was something thrilling about waking up from one. At the time, I was living with my roommate, Samantha, Sam as I called her. We had totally different work schedules, so we didn't interact much during the week, only catching up on weekends. This all happened in early August. I remember because it was scorching hot, and I had my window AC unit on full blast every night. The sound of the fan doubled as white noise, which always helped me sleep better. It was during one of those hot nights that I had the first nightmare. It happened a few days after my breakup with my ex, and life wasn't exactly going smoothly. In the dream, I was sitting at a dinner table surrounded by my family, but across from me stood a terrifying figure. It was tall and grotesque, with features like a mix of an alien from a sci-fi movie and a demon from folklore. Horns, claws, the works. As I stared, it suddenly appeared right beside me, looming over me. I panicked and ran, only to end up in what seemed like my room, or at least my brain's version of it. That's the last thing I remember before waking up. When I opened my eyes, the room was pitch dark, the AC humming in the background. My heart was pounding. Wow, that was creepy, I thought, as I scanned the room out of habit before eventually falling back asleep. The next night, I woke up abruptly to find my bedroom door slightly ajar. I almost always keep it shut unless I've been drinking or am sleepwalking, neither of which was the case. I assumed Sam might have been checking in to see if I was home. I got up, shut the door, and went back to sleep without overthinking it. The following morning, I texted Sam to ask if she had come into my room. Her reply? Nope. She wasn't one to play pranks, so I chalked it up to me forgetting a midnight bathroom trip or something. But the night after that, I had another nightmare. This time, I was in a pitch-black, empty room with the same demon-like creature from before. It didn't move its legs to walk, yet it kept getting closer and closer to me. Eventually, it was standing over me, its claw raised. I couldn't move or scream. It dragged its claw across my thigh, and I swear I felt the pain in the dream. The next thing I knew, I woke up. My room was dark, the AC fan still on, and my heart was racing again. But there was this faint stinging sensation on my thigh. When I ran my hand over it, I felt something real. I rushed to the bathroom and turned on the light. What I saw made me scream. A long, red gash across my upper thigh. I bolted to Sam's room, flipping on the lights and waking her up. When she saw the mark, she blurted, "What the hell happened to you?" I told her I had no idea. We both went to my room to investigate, flipping over sheets, checking for bugs, spiders, anything that could have caused it. Nothing made sense. Then Sam froze and motioned for me to be quiet. She turned off the AC, plunging the room into silence. And that's when we heard it. A faint sound, like someone breathing or shifting, coming from under my bed. Neither of us screamed. Somehow we managed to stay calm, glancing at each other, then at the bed. Without a word, we left the room and the apartment, slamming the door behind us. We ran to a neighbor's unit and pounded on the door until he answered. Explaining in hurried whispers, we begged to use his phone to call the police. As we waited, we heard the unmistakable sound of a door slamming shut. By the time the police arrived, the intruder was gone. The officers searched the apartment but didn't find anyone. They did find scratch marks on the underside of my bed frame, though, which made my stomach turn. That's when it hit me. The nightmares. The open door. The scratch on my thigh. It wasn't just my imagination, it was all connected. The demon in my dreams was this person, lurking in my room, possibly even standing over me while I slept. The realization haunts me to this day. Nightmares may just be our brain's way of processing fears, but sometimes they're a warning for something much darker. This happened when I was a little kid living in our old house in Warren County, New Jersey. I'm going to say I was about 6 or 7 years old. My older brother and I shared a bedroom on the top floor, that used to be a separate apartment that my dad rented out to an old lady. But she moved out, and so the upstairs was mainly for my older brother and I at that point. The layout was as follows. At the top of the stairs on the left was our bedroom, which used to be the old woman's living room. Straight ahead was the bathroom, and to the right was an extra kitchen and a small bedroom. We had a million toys in our room, as the room itself was huge, and it also had 2 parallel crawl-in closets on opposite sides of the room where we stored a million other toys and board games and stuff like that. There was one toy, though, a race car with a bunch of buttons on it. The buttons would make the car's lights turn on momentarily and play varying sound effects such as honking, revving, and driving sounds, and a little rock song. It was a toy we had for like ever because it was originally a gift for my brother when he was a little younger. It was a random night. My brother and I were both in bed, not yet asleep, when suddenly, like a jump scare from a scary movie, the loud revving sound of that car toy suddenly activated along with the lights of the car in the middle of the room. I looked at the car and instantly got scared and accused my brother Marcus of doing that to scare me. He was laughing hysterically, saying he didn't do it. I was completely terrified. The toy then stopped making noises and went quiet. I was extremely unsettled, as any little kid would be. But nevertheless, time marched on and I fell asleep. It wasn't for a while until something else happened. One night when Marcus and I were both in bed again, we both heard a weird thud in the room. Marcus insisted on trying to creep me out, saying there was a ghost in the room or something, and I kept yelling at him to shut up or I'd get Mom. He kept laughing until we both noticed a light in the corner of the room. It was the toy car again. I got out from the bed and ran straight down the stairs yelling for my mom. I got to my parents' room and yelled, "There's something in our room." I'm sure I gave a little 7-year-old spiel about how there's a ghost in the room, hearing a thud and the lights on the toy car turning on. Marcus entered the room and my mom defaulted to telling him to knock it off if he's trying to scare me. He said how could he turn the lights of the car on from his bed? I slept in my parents' room that night because I was too scared to sleep upstairs. It was a long while after that night and nothing happened. Not until one night, Marcus was not in the room. My guess is he was having a sleepover with one of his many friends. I was sleeping in the room by myself that night. I had long since tucked that car away in the small bedroom across the hall because it freaked me out. After my mom kissed me goodnight, I asked her to keep the door open since I was always scared when I was alone in the room. I rolled on my side and tried to go to sleep, but being that I was scared of being alone, I had a hard time getting tired that night. I felt wide awake. Then there was a sound I can't explain that came from down the hall. I flipped over to face the door, and the toy car rolled into the room with its lights on. I let out a scream straight from the bottom of my stomach as I cried for my mom and pressed my body up against the wall. Moments later, my parents both came up the stairs into the room, noticing the car on the floor. I screamed that someone pushed the car into the room. My dad went to go check the other rooms but said there was no one there. There weren't any places to hide up there besides the closets and under the beds, and my dad checked all of them. I don't know what my parents thought in that moment. On one hand, they probably thought the toy was malfunctioning or it's just my imagination, but on the other hand, I think they were also slightly freaked out. That toy car didn't have a feature to move on its own. My dad smashed the toy and threw it in the neighbor's trash to make me feel better. I slept in their room for a while until my dad forced me back upstairs eventually. This story is the reason why I believe in the paranormal and something after death.